Mom brain. It's real, and yet we never talk about it. Less sleep, more stress, tighter schedules, and pressures from all sides. When it comes to health, wellness, and performance, this is a critical topic for so many people. Welcome to the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bradford Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute, and today's guest is Dr. Ilyse Dobrow, a clinical psychologist and mom of 2 young boys, specializing in working with stressed out moms and the author of the popular book, Mom Brain, Proven Strategies to Fight the Anxiety, Guilt, and Overwhelming Emotions of Motherhood and Relax into Your New Self. On the coaching front, if you've been pondering pursuing a career as a health and wellness coach or adding the certification to your current professional toolbox, the first opportunity of 2022 has come and gone, but we do have 3 more on the calendar for this year that will qualify you for the MBHWC National Board Exam. The schedule and all the details at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And please, as always, if you have any questions you'd like to talk it through, how it fits your career plans, goals, reach out to us. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com anytime. We'll set up a time to talk. Now, it's time to be a catalyst with Dr. CBT mom, Dr. Ilyse Dobrow, on the latest episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. All right, Dr. DiMarco, just love going through this topic with you. It's a big topic. It's something we have not covered in our first 200 episodes. I can't believe we haven't covered it. But mom brain, what is mom brain and how does it rear its head in the lives of moms? And we'll talk about others too.
Yes, that's a big question. So I'll answer. So there's sort of 2 answers to the question of what is mom brain, kind of like why I picked it as the title of the book, but also like what we know of the science of mom brain. So I'll start with the science, which is really interesting. Very surprisingly, the brains of moms and parents in general have not been studied very much, which is crazy if you think about the transformation that happens, right, when any of us become parents. But it's a sort of a more recent topic of study. And what's been shown, interestingly, is that maternal brains, and by the way, paternal brains do change as a result of parenthood. And maternal brains in particular go through structural and functional changes aimed at supporting caregiving. So the way I like to think about it is, when we hear mom brain kind of in the press or in the popular media, like it's known as a bad thing, right? Oh, you forgot where your cell phone is, or you wore 2 different shoes to work or whatever. But actually, what the science shows us is that mom brain is adaptive for us because it's these structural and functional brain changes that allow us to put our kids at top of mind, sort of like making sure that our kids are on that mental priority list at all times, which is great and which is what we want, right? As mothers and all caregivers. Like I said, they're finding brain changes in the brains of dads, of moms who became parents in ways other than giving birth, et cetera. It's really fascinating.
Interesting.
So it's a good thing, right? It ensures that our kids are at top of mind. What that also means is that like some other stuff may fall off the mental priority list, right?
There's only so much you can fit. Exactly.
Right. There's only so much that can go on there. So that's kind of what we know. And there's really cool, like I encourage any of your listeners who are interested to like look up some of the recent science of mom brain. It's fascinating. And the work is emerging. I picked the title for the book because I just thought it encapsulated all of the many, many changes that moms and parents undergo when they first become parents, right? We're talking about identity changes and relationship changes, increases in all kinds of emotions. Anxiety becomes a big thing, especially now, during COVID and such. So like, I thought it was a good, encapsulation of all of that.
Right. What are some of you've touched on some as you were talking that through, but what are some of the things besides just, where's my phone? Oops, I wore 2 different. What are some of the common things that fall into that category?
You mean like the kind of things?
The types of things you might see, might show up, might demonstrate themselves in some of these studies they're looking at.
So you mean like in terms of what is going on in the brain?
Exactly.
Kind of thing? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. So like my background is in cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety disorders. And among other things, I used to work with obsessive compulsive disorder a fair amount. And what's really interesting, and I'm going to not cite the study correctly, so I'm going to say there's a study that I have in my head that we'll find, that that likened actually what happens in the maternal brain to what happens with folks who have obsessive compulsive disorder, meaning there is this sort of like obsessive type focus on the baby. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was something like, it sort of peaked at around 1 month of age, when the baby's around 1 month of age-ish. For some, it lasted longer, for some shorter, I believe. But basically, it was sort of an interesting idea that what's happening with your brain is it is tuning in to that thing you need to be paying attention to, right? And, one could certainly argue in the beginning, it is the thing that is taking up all of your mental space, right? It is that thing in the way that, sometimes what we see in OCD is folks will get kind of hooked into an obsession and have a lot of difficulty kind of switching cognitive set, right? It was, again, the study was interesting in that it sort of posited this idea that happens, in maternal brains as well.
There's so many rabbit trails I want to chase here. Okay, so let's just play with this one a little bit. It increases some of the OCD-like tendencies or chemical reactions about a month in. One of the things that popped in mind as you were going through that was there are so many parents that don't have a life, like they're living through their kids. So let's jump forward 12 years now. The kids in soccer, ice skating, dance, gymnastics, whatever. And dad, mom, they're living through that kid. Is that a connection to, is that an extension of that? Or is this a completely different element? As you were saying that, I was thinking of that parent of the early teen sports kid that is being ridiculous. And we know and I've fallen into that to a point myself. We know we're being ridiculous, but any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the scientists would say no, that we're talking about a different phenomenon, because the way they talk about mom brain, as I said, is very much in like the early stages and what happens. And here's the thing, like the brain is always making connections,
sure.
Right? Our brain is always developing. What I would say is that to me, and this is kind of more where my work comes in as the psychologist, not the scientist, right? What I would say is that as the kids are getting older, we're talking now about things that are socialized, right? So this notion of, oh, if your kid is in sports, like you got to get your kid to be the best of the best, right? And we're getting these messages from social media. We're getting these messages from relatives. We're getting these messages from all different places. So to my mind, like and this happens, of course, even in the beginning too, where we see the effects of all of these messages we're getting about how we should be as parents, what we should prioritize for our kids, what's important, right? And the sports parents thing, I mean, goodness, I could talk about that for a really long time. And I talk in my book, I have a whole chapter on perfectionism. And I think that really comes into play when we're looking at our kids who are playing sports and us kind of trying to maybe live our experiences through them or whatnot. So again, I think there's so much socialization that happens as well, right? That contributes to the way we're approaching sports, our kids socializing, I mean, many other things.
Right. And for those folks that are on that fence, go back and listen to David Epstein's. He wrote a book called Range, and we had him as a guest a while ago. And he talks about you don't need to get them super specialized young. It doesn't help in the long run. So sleep is obviously a limited resource for parents, especially moms. In fact, you've called it momsomnia. I love that. Is that kind of a key driver of mom brain, that just how it is? Or are there tips that you can put into play in spite of, we know we're not going to have this resource like we normally would or would like to?
Right. Well, first of all, let me give credit where it's due. Momsomnia comes from my friend, Dr. Shelby Harris,
nice,
who is a sleep specialist, who is fabulous. And she wrote a book called The Women's Guide to Overcoming Insomnia, and was kind enough to actually talk to me for Mom Brain. So credit where it's due. Yes. Momsomnia can mean a lot of things. And I think when Shelby talks about it, it's often in the context of what they now actually also call revenge bedtime procrastination, which is basically this idea that when you finally get your kids to bed, the last thing you want to do is go to bed, even though it's important for you to go to bed, because it's the first chance you have you have any time to yourself. We have all been there, right? We start binging a show and all of a sudden it's midnight, 12:30, 1 a.m. So Shelby often talks about momsomnia in that context. But then of course there's the early days of momsomnia, which is just like you are not sleeping. And it's really hard. And I think what's great about Shelby is that, and again, I have like a kind of a little interview with her in the book, is that, she sort of talks about how there's some things you have to accept with this, right? Like, you've got to accept that in those early days, like you won't be sleeping super great, right? You've got to accept that like it may not be you at your best, but you also have to recognize that like even on less sleep, you can still function, you can still perform, you can still kind of do what you need to do. And so just a couple of tips I'll throw out there that I talk about in the book. One of those things that I think is really important is like, if you are raising your kid with a partner, make sure that at nighttime you're splitting the duties. One of the things that I hear about all the time from moms is they'll say, and this is from nursing moms, they'll say, I was the one who nursed. And so I figured, I'll just be the one who always gets up with the baby because I'm the one who nurses the baby. And then somehow that persisted to the point where you've now got a kid who's 5, 6, 7 who won't accept the partner in the middle of the night, who only wants, I hear about that a lot. And one of the things you can do with that, even if you have a situation where one partner is nursing, is say, okay, well, anytime the wake up issue is not a nursing issue, send the other partner out. Or even, and this is again, a great tip of Shelby's, even, you can have the partner bring the baby to the nursing partner to nurse and then bring the baby back, change the diaper, et cetera. Because once again, that's a way of getting both partners involved and hopefully like minimizing the sleep loss in the nursing partner. So that's one kind of hot tip. Another hot tip, Shelby also does talk about like, there's this whole nap while the baby's napping. And I remember when I was my kids are now 7 and 10, but when I had my first and I heard that, it would get me aggravated because I'd be like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Except that I have like 8 piles of laundry and like, trying to catch up on work and trying to catch up on things. But it can be really important to try to do that, even if you're not actually sleeping. Even if what you're doing is just resting when the baby is napping, like it's a really good way just to kind of power down a little bit and recharge. So that's another one that I like. And, I'm a fan too. Like there's a book called Sleeping Through the Night. It's my favorite kid sleep book. I love it, by Jody Mandel. It's from like the early 2000s, but it's everything still applies. And I think it's terrific. And I think she's someone who's great to follow too, to like think through, okay, when do I start making a sleep schedule for my kid? How do I make this work? And she speaks about it in such a compassionate, non-punitive way that I also always encourage patients to check out her work to hopefully get their kids to sleep on a somewhat regular schedule, like as quickly as they can.
Right. Okay, good. Very good. The subtitle of your book is Loaded, and we'll have a link to the book, by the way, folks, so you can track this down. Highlighting the anxiety, guilt, overwhelming emotions of motherhood. Can you talk us through some of those and how maybe they're unique to moms?
Sure. Yes. So there's a lot happening. I like to think of it as just like an emotional roller coaster, right? There is so much happening emotionally. And I think about it in a couple of different ways. The first thing is that I think there's a lot of positive emotions, to be sure. You're totally in love, it feels blissful at times, et cetera. But there's also a lot of negative emotions, right? There's a lot that's really hard when you become a parent. It's anxiety producing to be responsible for the life of a tiny human, especially these days. Yeah. There's a lot of judgment that comes from people from people you don't know on social media, from all corners, right? I think there's a lot of grief that can come when you become a parent because you do lose some of who you were before you had a kid who has taken up a lot of your time. So there's all these negative emotions too. And I think what's difficult for a lot of moms is admitting these emotions, right? Is allowing themselves to feel these emotions without thinking, oh, this makes me a bad mom, or I'm not a natural mom because I hate this right now, or I'm not a natural mom because I'm bored stiff, with this 5-month-old who does nothing, right? Like there's so much of the clinical work I do is helping moms to accept the negative emotions. So there's the positives and negatives. And then I think there's the interesting contradictory emotions that all parents experience. And I say moms because that's my book, but much of this applies across parents, which is to say those moments when you're both like thrilled to be away from your kid and like dying to get back to your kid, right? Or moments, the big COVID one for people, where you're simultaneously so grateful that your kid is healthy and you can keep your kid at home while there's a surge, and also ready to sell your kid to the highest bidder. Right? And I think, like, you know, understanding that those contradictory emotions make sense is also so important. So, you know, again, it's a lot of emotions. It's seemingly contradictory emotions. And again, I think the task and one of the main themes of my book is to help parents to recognize everything you're feeling is okay. Everything you're feeling makes sense. It doesn't make you a bad mother. It might be very confusing, but it's normal and it makes sense. And you've got to use your negative emotions not as something you'll then, you know, self-flagellate on. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm bored. I can't believe I'm angry at the baby, right? But instead use it to say, okay, I'm struggling. Let me see this as a cue for me to get some help, for me to reach out, for me to do what I need to do because this is hard. So that's a short description of the many things that happen to us emotionally, all of us, moms and dads and other parents alike, when we become parents.
So the reflection piece is huge. And yet we have 3 kids. They're adults now. So it's been a while. So I'm searching the memory banks here, but I don't remember spending a lot of time reflecting. It was kind of getting through the day, survival. My wife's amazing. She carried a lot of that weight, but how does a parent, mother or father, partner, create that space to do the reflecting, or any tips along those lines? Because that seemed to be central to what you were talking about there.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of mindfulness work, which we use. So my specialty is cognitive behavioral therapy. We use a ton of mindfulness in CBT and in DBT and ACT, which are related evidence-based treatments that I also practice. And I'm a big fan of basically parents just like saving a teeny bit of time each day to just do like some emotional check-ins with themselves. I mean, it sounds so funny, but like what I've had a lot of parents do is either set a timer for themselves or like set an alarm to go off, or like maybe 2-3 times a day, they just stop what they're doing for a second and say, what am I feeling right now? And I also encourage them to practice regular mindfulness so that they get good at doing this. But basically it's like you have an emotional alarm that goes off and you say to yourself, all right, let me kind of scan myself for a sec. Like, how am I doing? And it sounds so funny, but it can really stave off a lot of what I call the like nighttime parental meltdowns, which happen a lot when the kids are really little, right? Which is that you, as you described, which is so true, you kind of barrel through your day and you're just trying to survive and you're not thinking more than a minute ahead, and the stresses pile up. And by the time you get to the end of the day, you have that like adult size meltdown, right? Where you're like, like blowing. And I think if you can check in with yourself periodically during the day, and if you notice you're struggling, try to take steps to help yourself, you'll be in such a better place. And I mean, you're not going to avoid those meltdowns entirely, but you'll have fewer of them. And like I said, too, I'm really into mindfulness, and I encourage moms to practice it, and all parents on a regular basis. You know, if you get one of those apps, mindfulness apps like Calm or Headspace, like they've got exercises that are like 3 minutes long. So I'll say, hey, just once a day, can you do like a 3-minute mindfulness exercise? Yeah. Like at the beginning, if that's all you can do, great, do that. Because you sort of train your brain to learn to be mindful. And then it becomes easier during those times when you're doing the emotional check-in with yourself. It becomes easier to do so when you're someone who's kind of good at the mindfulness thing.
Well, I love the lack of, you're not asking me to make a big commitment. You're saying set an alarm 3 times a day, check in. Maybe it's 30 seconds, maybe it's a minute, maybe it's 10 seconds, but at least it creates that shift of, okay, how am I feeling? And Susanna talks about the halt, you know, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I bored? But it wouldn't even have to be that complex. Just that momentary, what am I feeling right now? What does that look like? I could be holding the baby at that time. It doesn't have to be like silent room with candles going or anything like that. It's just,
I'll do that.
Yeah. Hello. All right. You've touched on this next question, but I want to dig into it a little bit more. You've spoken in other interviews about the positive aspects of mom brain. Can you expand on some of the things you've already kind of laid out there for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the major positive aspect, right, is that kids are top of mind, and that's really important when you're caring for a kid, right? I mean, I think you want to prioritize your child because then you're making sure they're getting what they need. So I think that's positive. I think also as it's funny. I always say like mom brain is like a permanent condition. Like it's not something that you have and then all of a sudden your kid gets to a certain age and you're like, oh man, I don't have to think about this kid anymore. Yeah. Your kids will always be, and I'm sure you can attest to this, even having adult kids, right? They're always going to be a huge part of your life and top of mind. And I think the challenge becomes like figuring out how to navigate that as your kids are at different ages and stages, right? But I think it continues to be advantageous to have your kid at top of mind. But what the trick is, as your kids are getting older, and this is sort of where I am right now, because my kids are 7 and 10, so they're kind of in the middle, the trick becomes to figure out, okay, well, how do I these kids are mostly at school. My sons do activities. I'm not with them for large swaths of the day like I used to. Like, what does that mean for like where they're fitting in my mental priority list from day to day? Where's my work now fitting, right? Where is my husband now fitting? Because I can actually talk to him again, which is great.
Wow.
Which took a long time to get back to that. Where's my extended family now fitting? So I think it's advantageous to think about what your parent brain, mom brain is looking like. I'll tie this also to something that I talk a lot about in the book. I have in the back of the book a values worksheet, and I'm very into values and really thinking through what you value, what's important to you.
Oh, yeah.
In different areas of your life. And in fact, you interviewed my friend Elle Schoenbrunn, who's very big into.
She's wonderful.
Wonderful, yes. And she does a lot of talk about values as well. So to tie that a little bit to like the mom brain thing, I think to always be thinking about what you value and what's important to you can really help you to sort of make that mental priority list when your kids start to get a little older and they don't have to be your sole focus like every second,
Right.
And so, I can talk more about the value stuff for sure, but I think that ties into that as well.
Okay, good. Okay, so just a reference for folks out there, her website and the blogs are drcbtmom.com. So, and you've mentioned CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy plays a significant role in what you're doing and you're writing. Our listeners are likely, they've heard the term. We've had some other guests talk about it, but can you talk us through, kind of separate from the mom brain, what are some of the key elements of CBT?
Sure. So CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And the way that I look at it, there's sort of 3 key elements to it. I should say before that it's an evidence-based treatment. Mm-hmm. It's based on research. And it's unlike other forms of therapy in that it isn't about necessarily gaining insight into the origin of a problem or really unpacking your childhood. I mean, we do that sometimes, but that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to give people strategies to manage their here and now stuff. So if I'm anxious now in this moment, yes, I can consider like why I have this anxiety and where it came from. Or I can think, okay, I got to get through this moment. So like, what's the skill that I can use to help me? Right. So that's a good sort of general description of CBT. And then what I see is like the 3 sort of subject areas of CBT. Cognitive means how you're thinking about things. So the idea is to think about, all right, well, are there certain patterns of thinking that I tend to exhibit that maintain my anxiety, my low mood, whatever it is? And can I learn strategies to challenge those patterns of thinking? So that's the cognitive piece. The behavioral piece, just like it sounds like, is about changing behavior. And there's a lot of all of this in mom brain, especially the behavioral piece of like, am I behaving in a certain way that is keeping things difficult for me, maintaining, again, my anxiety, my low mood, et cetera? And are there ways I can change my behavior to help me out? The last piece that I touched on before is the mindfulness piece, right? So really learning to be in the present moment as much as you can. And I think mindfulness too, a lot of what I talk about in the book is drawn from dialectical behavior therapy, which is another evidence-based treatment. It's an offshoot of CBT. And in DBT, there's a lot of discussion of sort of the balance between acceptance and change, learning how to be mindful of the things that you cannot change and have to accept, and also mindful of the things you can change and working towards changing those things. So a lot of what we do in CBT is talk in those terms. Like, are there things we need to accept, and can we learn to be mindful and, mindful of those things and compassionate towards ourselves? And then are there things that we can change? And again, that's where the behavioral piece comes in, and the cognitive piece too. What are strategies we can use to create change? So those are kind of the basic kind of building blocks of CBT.
Well, I like the way you broke that down, because it even if no one's or somebody hasn't heard that specific term or whatever, the way you broke it down, it's like, oh yeah, so cognitive, my behavior, and the mindful piece. That's a nice flow. So very nice. Now, in terms of why CBT plays such a valuable role for moms, so help us dig into that a little bit.
Sure. So I'll start by telling you sort of how I got into this, which will answer that question. When I opened my practice in New Jersey, I was pregnant or about to be pregnant with my first son. And so I think by virtue of like my particular age and stage in life, a lot of women at my age and stage in life were coming to me for therapy. And some of them did have PMADs, which are perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Many of them, however, did not. And they were kind of going through ups and downs and sideways of becoming a new mother and experiencing all the things you and I have talked about, right? The relationship changes, identity changes, emotional changes, et cetera. And what I found was, as I mentioned before, I was trained to do CBT for anxiety disorders and related conditions. And I found that, these skills that were developed for, OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, among other things, can really be adapted very nicely to meet the needs of moms who in the moment are really stressed out and are really suffering. And I found that it was a really good fit because, parents of new children don't have a ton of time to delve into a lengthy course of psychotherapy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they can learn specific skills to help them in the here and now manage whatever the case may, whatever it is, their kid not sleeping, their neighbor judging them, any and all of those things. And so I really tried also to design the book to be in kind of really small chunks so that parents can dig in and dig out, like depending on what they need at a given time, and just kind of go to one section and learn a skill or two to help them with whatever they're struggling with currently. So again, I felt like it was a really good match, and I was kind of using the skills on myself too, because once again, I was in the same boat as the moms that I was treating, and found like, wow, yes, like cognitive restructuring works great for, moms as great as it works for, other stuff. And so I really felt like it was a good fit, and I started doing some writing about it. And that was what ultimately led to the book.
How did you, it's so difficult for anyone, a counselor, a coach, psychologist, research, even they call research me-search in many ways. How did you avoid making this too autobiographical as you put the book together, having just gone through that phase and frankly, continuing through that phase in your life? I'm just curious. It seems like it would have come so natural. It would have been the battle you would have had to fight the entire time you were writing, because you are you at least very recently were in the midst of that.
Yeah, I was very deliberate in including my own stories in there. So that's how I navigated it.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that when I was writing the book, when I started writing the book, and it was a longer journey because COVID, as for so many authors, COVID disrupted it. I had to go back after COVID and make revisions. But when I first started, my kids were like 5 and 8. So I was out of the trenches, enough so that I felt like I had some perspective on the stuff that I'd gone through. And so it was really interesting because I very deliberately did include some of my own stories because that's just the way that I write about psychology. Like I really prioritize trying to connect with readers. And this is true of patients who I see as well. I'm not one of those psychologists who says nothing about myself and I'm a total blank slate. I don't work that way. So it was very important for me to share some of my own stuff to connect with my readers. But I was so lucky in that I had a little distance. And with that distance came a lot more wisdom than I had when I was actually going through it. So it was fun because I'd be like, my stories are like, here's where I screwed up. Now I can tell you what I would have done differently. And that was kind of my experience of writing it, where I just, again, I was able to look back. And so I could share a lot of the stories that at the time were not funny that now to me are funny and that I was able to explain in a funny way, with the benefit, of course, of hindsight and having done so much more work with moms since I was at that stage.
Great. Holidays. You offered some great tips to people that follow you on Twitter, caught these. Holidays now in the rearview mirror. What are some of those tips that might apply as we go into the summertime months?
Yeah, I am a huge fan, and I would imagine you are too with all of your athletic pursuits. I'm a huge fan of scheduling and prioritizing to make sure that things happen.
Absolutely.
And there's in many, this relates to summers in many ways. So the first thing I'll say is, when I talk about any kind of vacation, holiday, summer break, et cetera, I think one really good thing to do is just, if you've got a whole bunch of unstructured days, try to make a plan for each day. And it doesn't have to be an extensive plan. It could be, if we're talking about summer, it could be like, wake up, walk around the neighborhood, have snack, play a little in the backyard, sleep, wake up from nap, go to town pool. Like we're talking about something like that. It doesn't have to be extensive. But the idea is to really wake up each day having a sense of what you're going to do, because it really relieves anxiety for parents, particularly when your kids are really young. Like one of the things, truthfully, that I found scariest as a new mom was completely unplanned, unstructured days with a very small child. I'd be like, oh my God, it is 4:30 in the morning and my son just got up. What am I going to do with myself until 7 at night when my son goes to bed? So I'm a big fan of doing that, and particularly for summer times, vacation times where there's not built-in structure, right? So just to think through the night before. If you have older kids too, it's actually great to let them know what the plan is for the day. And if they're old enough and into it, like involve them in the planning for the day, because same as for you, it reduces anxiety for them to know what the day is going to look like, to know what they're going to expect. So that's one kind of summer tip. Another thing I'll say too about scheduling, and I have a whole chapter in the book on this, is I think it's really important to schedule taking care of yourself in every day. And I don't love the term self-care because I think it's gotten associated with like manicures and pedicures and stuff like that. And that might be self-care for some people, but it's not for a lot of people. What I mean is just making sure that in each day you have something that you're looking forward to, that you're doing just for yourself. And the importance of doing this when you have kids is that, like, in order for taking care of yourself to happen, you really do have to plan it ahead of time, unfortunately. It's not like before you have kids and you're like, oh, I feel like going for a run, I'll go for a run. I feel like binging this show for 3 hours, I'm going to do it. When you have kids, you really can't do that. You've got to plan ahead of time and then make sure you do what you need to do to set the stage to make sure you're getting that, self-care, for lack of a better word, time in, so that would be, for example, like, oh, I really want to go for a run tomorrow. I'm just going to put my partner on notice that they're going to watch the kid from 10 to 11 so I can run. Or, if you have older kids, I'm going to let my kid know that, like, during there's going to be a quiet hour in the middle of Saturday afternoon where, like, mom's going to go do like her Peloton app,
Right.
like basically what you want to do is put things into place so that you can get that time to take care of yourself, even if it's brief, even if it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So that's another way in which I think scheduling is important. And again, in a case like a summer or a vacation where you have no childcare help sometimes, right? I mean, some people do, but some people have no childcare help during vacations or summers. You really have to prioritize getting a break for yourself during those times, because otherwise it is an onslaught. And listen, that's been true of COVID also. Like, I've spent past 2 years of the pandemic, like talking with patients about, oh my God, you're home with your kids again. All right, like, what are we going to do to give you a mental break, because you need it so desperately.
I love that, because it's almost counterintuitive. You almost are like, well, we've got a break. We just got an easy day to day. And you're saying, yeah, but if we take these steps to create that schedule, then the important stuff's going to happen. So great reminder. Comparison to others, big issue for all of us. You've discussed how it can play an especially negative role for moms. Can you provide some advice on the comparison front for us here?
Sure. And I think this is, to my mind, like, everybody does this. It's not just moms.
Absolutely.
I do think the pandemic made it worse because everybody was on social media. Mm-hmm. And because, listen, that was our lifeline, right? We couldn't actually see real
That's
people.
That's the break room.
So we were on social media, and I think comparison is, a huge issue there. So there's a whole chapter in it about it, rather, in the book. But I'll share kind of my the general feedback I give about this stuff, which is basically like, you've really got to learn to become critical of your own comparison making, which is to say, when you notice yourself comparing, kind of doing some cognitive work to talk yourself through the comparison and to really figure out if the comparison is fair and makes sense. So what I mean by that, I always give this example, but I will often talk to moms who will say, oh yeah, I think that my, neighbor is so amazing. Like, you should see her at daycare drop-off. She's got everything together, and like she kids are happy, and my kid's screaming, and I've got like 2 different shoes on, and everything's awful. And I will say, okay, well, like, can we break this down? Give me more information about your neighbor. And this is true even on social media too. I will say, give me more information. So inevitably, I get one of the following responses. One response is, gosh, I really don't know much about this person. This is what happens with social media all the time, right? Moms will compare themselves to other people on social media they've never met. And so I'll say, and this is even, they'll compare themselves to kids, people they knew as kids in 8th grade who they've not seen since. Yeah. And I'll say, okay, time out. Like, you don't have enough information to make this comparison. You have no idea what this person's life is like. You have no idea what it took to get that happy kid at daycare drop-off. You have no idea what it took in the case of social media to get that beautiful sun-kissed photo of all the kids on the beach. Not a fair comparison. You don't know any information about this person, right? And a lot of times, right, that when you do learn information, you find out maybe people have a lot of help with their kids, right? Maybe they have a photographer following them around, as is the case on social media with momfluencers, as they call them now. So that's one thing I'll hear. The second thing I'll hear is the mom will say, oh yeah, I can tell you some information about my neighbor, this person on social media, whatever. And it comes out that the mom doesn't really like this person very much or respect this person. And so then I'll be like, whoa, wait a minute. So you're being brought down. You're letting yourself feel judged by someone whose opinions you don't value, right? Or whose values you don't share. Like, that doesn't make sense. I always use the analogy. It's almost as if you find a medical doctor online and you look at their credentials and you kind of think that they're a quack, and then you follow their medical advice anyway. Like, that's sort of how I see it, right? If you think your neighbor is not aligned with you in terms of how she's raising her kids, in terms of who she is as a person, in terms of what her values are, she's not an appropriate point of comparison for you, right? Similarly, I mean, goodness gracious, with like the momfluencers and the celebrity moms and all that kind of stuff, like, it's often the case where people will be like, oh, I follow so-and-so. I'm fascinated by her. Like, I think she's, I have all kinds of like negative opinions about her. And I'm like, okay, well then, like, why are you allowing yourself to be taken in by comparisons with her? It just doesn't make sense, right? So it's and then the other question that I will always ask is like, is there somebody in your life, preferably in real life, not on social media, whose values you share, whose opinions you value, who is an appropriate target for comparison, who's someone whose advice you can seek out, who's someone you trust. Can we find that person? It's even better if that person has kids slightly older than your kids, right? Because they've recently been through everything you're going through, right? So like, but I will say, okay, if you can identify that person, when you start to compare yourself to an inappropriate target for comparison, like try to stop yourself, try instead to think about what that other person might do, seek out that other person's opinion and advice, right? Do that very consciously. So again, it's about really being very conscious of the comparing you're doing and challenging the unfair comparing. Because it's just, as I said, like 9 times out of 10, when I'm talking to moms, it's either that they don't know anything about the person to whom they're comparing themselves, or they don't much respect the person to whom they're comparing themselves. And those are just unfair comparisons to make.
Well, and obviously comparison is rarely logical. So I love the way you said, we're not saying let's be logical. We're saying let's replace it with something that makes more sense. So great advice. Last question, partner. You discussed relationship with your partner with the additional children. We know anyone who's been a parent knows that's a tough nut to crack. Tips to help couples through this new phase of life. So let's keep the focus on that first year. What are some things that can be done? It's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be easy. It's a stressful, low sleep time. But can you just give us a few nuggets there?
Sure. So the first piece of advice that I always give about this is basically you need to make some time for FaceTime with your partner. And I don't mean FaceTime like on an iPhone. I mean like actual FaceTime. John Gottman, who's a really famous couples researcher, talks about having a regular State of the Union, he calls it, where like you very deliberately plan to sit and talk about things. I think this is a great idea. And I think in particular for parents of really small kids, because listen, if you don't plan a time where you're engaging with your partner on a semi-regular basis, it could be, we plan Saturday nights once the baby's in, our FaceTime is Saturday night from 7 to 8, or you sort of figure out as a couple what works best for you and what makes the most sense. In those first few years, if you don't make time for that, it will not happen, right? Because, one of the things that I hear all the time from parents that I work with is that they and their partner are like two ships passing in the night, right? It's just like they're like trying to survive. As you were mentioning before, right? You're sort of like white knuckling it at the beginning. So that is my first major piece of advice. Just make sure, and again, back to my love of scheduling, you schedule a time, a regular time where you are having FaceTime. And the FaceTime can be anything. It can be talking through a disagreement. It can be logistics, like talking through the schedule for the week. It can be just like venting about how hard things are, or talking about an episode of reality TV you just watched. Like it doesn't matter what it is necessarily. What matters is the connection. Because one of the things that I see a lot in parents of young kids is like resentments building up. And I think if you can have a regular exchange of ideas and regularly communicate, it'll be less likely to happen that you become resentful. On that point too, another thing that I am a big fan of is really sitting down and figuring out, okay, who is going to do what? So if you have any familiarity with Eve Rodsky's work, like she's great. And she has this book called Fair Play, where she actually has cards that you use with your partner to figure out who does what. I love it.
Interesting.
And I, whether you do that, whether you just like sit down, when I talk about my book, it's basically like sit down, make a big list of everything that has to get done, like as soon as you can after a kid is born.
Or before.
And figure out. Yeah, totally. The only reason I say after is because I think people don't necessarily know.
Yeah, you don't get it. Yeah, that's a great point.
Like they don't know what the time, right. But basically making a list and saying, all right, like who's going to do what? Like, let's be really deliberate about this. Because what can happen is one parent can take the reins on everything. And then like I was saying before, like you're a couple of years in and that parent is still the one taking the reins on everything. Like that's not fair. And the truth is it doesn't have to be that each parent does it 50-50. Like different households work differently. So there might be one parent who spends a lot more time at home than the other parent, right? There may be one parent who's like also caring for elderly parents of their own. So like, it isn't as if it has to be 50-50. It has to feel fair. It has to feel fair to both partners, right? So to really sit down and say, okay, and I should throw in another thing there too, which is like, you really want each partner to take over all of the steps of something. So actually what I talk about in my book is like Cub Scouts. I was never a Girl Scout. I don't know from that. Both of my younger and my older son is now not doing it, but my younger son is still a Cub Scout. My husband had been a Cub Scout. So I was like, all right, you're going to be the Cub Scout person. But that doesn't just mean you like take him to like the pack meetings. It means like you get all the stuff from the Cub Scouts.
You own it.
You own it. You figure out how to get the patches on the thing. You figure out like what he's going to do for the Cub Scout overnights. Like you do everything. And that's really important that as you're going through tasks, like, as you said, you got to take ownership of the full thing. And you sort of have to continue that as your kids get older, right? Because that list of stuff you got to do for your kids changes as your kids get older and get more into stuff. And certainly once the sports come in, that's a whole different ball game, right? Of like what you have to do in terms of organizing and gear and getting the kids there. So I'm really big about that too. Like I said, as soon as you possibly can, to start thinking through, all right, what's going to be each of our tasks, and to continually revise that as the tasks change, I think is so, so important because resentment otherwise can build quickly.
It covers everything else then.
Like on both sides. Yeah.
Great stuff. Where were you 27 years ago? we could have used you.
I had no idea what was flying about parenting 27 years ago.
Yeah, obviously I didn't either. But in any case, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. It was great having you join us.
It was so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Something makes me think this will be one of our more popular episodes. Great insights, perfect timing from Dr. DiMarco. Thanks to you for tuning into the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. We're grateful to have you choosing to spend time with us each and every week. And we really appreciate any time you pass the word on about what we're doing here to bring evidence-based health and wellness to the forefront. Next week's guest is best-selling author Brad Stulberg, discussing his hot new book, The Practice of Groundedness. As always, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or tap into additional health, wellness, performance resources on the website at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Bradford Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast, or maybe over the YouTube coaching channel.